Welcome back to our study of the book of Romans. In our last study, we looked at Romans chapter 7, verses 1 through 12. Paul begins chapter 7 analogizing the Jews' relationship with the law to a marriage relationship. The law governs a person's life so long as he or she is alive. Upon death, its sovereignty ends. Since the Jew died to the law when they were baptized into Christ, they should no longer feel obligated to serve in the oldness of the letter. They were now married to Christ and free to serve in the newness of the Spirit, in which they could live a meaningful life to God. The law which defined sin was not the problem. Rather, the law exposed the weakness of the flesh, and sin exploited that weakness to increase the desire for sin. The fault is not in the law of God, it is within us. Let's pick up in verse 13. Has then what is good become death to me? Certainly not. But sin, that it might appear sin, was producing death in me through what is good, so that sin through the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. Let's remember, Paul begins the 7th chapter by addressing those who know the law, verse 1. His objective in chapter 7 is to demonstrate that sin used the law as a tool to strengthen its hold. The trouble was not with the law. It was holy and just and good, verse 12. The trouble lay with our weakness. The good commandment produced in me all manner of evil desire, verse 8. So the Jew who carefully and conscientiously kept the law as closely as possible found themselves not freed from sin, but rather further enslaved. So Paul asks, has then what is good become death to me? Paul explores from a different angle whether or not the law is responsible for mankind's condition. Here's this good thing from God that sin uses to strengthen itself, and it ultimately leads to death. If following the law only leads to death, how can I say it is good? His answer, like the previously asked questions, is certainly not. But sin, that it might appear sin, was producing death in me through what is good, so that sin through the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. Once again, let's remember, what was the function of the law? Chapter 3, verse 20, by the law is the knowledge of sin. And as Paul says in verse 7, I would not have known sin except through the law, for I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, you shall not covet. And as we discussed back in chapter 5, verse 20, the law entered that the offense might abound. By describing sin more fully, sin was more apparent after the law was given. And because sin used the law to strengthen its appeal, the frequency of our failures increased. Thus sin became exceedingly sinful. But let's consider a broader point. There was more to the law than simply defining sin. One of God's objectives in giving the law was to bring our inadequacies to the surface so that we could see more clearly the operation of desire. The one who endeavored to conscientiously keep the commands of God noticed, to a greater degree, the internal workings of desire. In verses 15 through 23, Paul described this as a struggle between the inward man and the law of sin that was in his members. The law served to bring that struggle to the surface. This struggle, in turn, highlighted the contrast between life and death. The law says the one who keeps the commands of God will live, and the one who cannot keep it will die. We see this contrast better by experiencing a sense of life and death. Paul felt like a part of him died when he learned that covetousness was a sin. Sometimes the truth is more fully discovered by experience. So what made sin exceedingly sinful? Two things. First, the law brought to the surface our desire for sin and initiated a struggle with our desire to do well. And second, there was a stark contrast between life and death experienced by the one who endeavors to keep the commands of God while in the bondage of sin. Thus sin became exceedingly sinful. So once again, Paul emphasizes that the deficiency was not with the law, but it was with us. Let's go on to verse 14. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. To properly understand verses 15 through 23, we must contextualize it within Paul's broader argument. He's talking to those who know the law of Moses, his fellow Jewish Christians. He reveals that not only have they died to sin in Christ, but also in Christ they have died to the law. Sin used the law against those Jews who followed it by increasing their desire for sin. And Paul confesses his own weakness to covetousness and relates his experiences with the law. He makes it clear that the law is not at fault. The commandment is holy and just and good. The weakness lies with us. All of this flows into verse 14. For we know that the law is spiritual. The law was from God, therefore it is spiritual in origin and nature. However, even though the law is spiritual, I am carnal, Paul says, sold under sin. What does it mean to be carnal, sold under sin? Returning to chapter 6, verse 6, we remember that in baptism, our old man was crucified with him that the body of sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves of sin. As we discussed in our study of chapter 6, Paul puts baptism between slavery to sin and freedom from sin. He says in verse 7, for he who has died has been freed from sin. Prior to our baptism into Christ, we were slaves of sin. Later in chapter 6, verse 17, Paul reminds us that we used to be slaves of sin. But God be thanked that though you were slaves of sin, yet you obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine to which you were delivered. To be sold under sin means one is enslaved to sin, a condition we all were in, Jew and Gentile alike, prior to baptism. So when Paul says, I am carnal, sold under sin, he describes his condition before Christ, when he was living under the law of Moses. In saying that, I understand some of you will disagree. The phenomenon Paul experiences in verses 15 through 23 can be experienced by anyone who attempts to keep the commandments of Christ under certain circumstances. For that reason, many Christians interpret Paul's narrative as a struggle they will experience until the day of their death. I disagree. I believe Paul narrates what we experience as we attempt to keep the commands of God while enslaved to sin. What does Paul say? For the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. That being said, I do believe this struggle is something we as Christians can experience. And I will tell you why when we reach verse 24. In the meantime, I intend to interpret verses 15 through 23 under the assumption that those verses recount the lived experience of someone who attempted to keep the law of Moses while enslaved to sin. Let's proceed to verse 15. For what I am doing I do not understand. For what I will to do, that I do not practice. But what I hate, that I do. If then I do what I will not to do, I agree with the law that it is good. But now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. For what I will to do, that I do not practice, but what I hate, that I do. What Paul wills to do is to keep the law of God. There is a part of him that wants to do what is right. But he finds himself doing what he hates, disobeying the commands of God. When he disobeys the commandment, I do what I will not to do, there is a part of him that knows it is wrong. I agree with the law that it is good. He can see that the law is good, a reiteration of what he says in verse 12. Therefore the law is holy and the commandment holy and just and good. So the deficiency he sees is not in the law, it's in himself. Notice there is one thing he does not understand. He knows what is right, he wants to do what is right, but finds himself more often than not doing what a part of him does not want to do. But now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. There is a part of Paul who wants to keep the command, what I will to do, verse 15, but that part is not leading him. It is no longer I who do it. Sin is leading him, sin that dwells in me. What is it like to live under the dominion of sin? How would one describe slavery to sin? Well, in this passage, Paul personifies sin, speaking of it as if it is a separate entity that dwells in him. And this entity has mastered him. Even when he wants to do what is right, he finds himself doing what is wrong. As a slave, he has no real autonomy. He has a will, but his will does not matter. His will does not matter because sin, like a cruel master, overrides his will and compels him to do its bidding. So the law tells him to do what is right. Paul wants to do what is right, but he is enslaved to sin, thus rendering him unable to do what's right. Living under the dominion of sin leaves one who wants to obey the commands of God with a sense of powerlessness, a sense Paul continues to explore in verse 18. For I know that in me, that is, in my flesh, nothing good dwells. For to will is present with me, but how to perform what is good I do not find. For the good that I will to do I do not do, but the evil I will not to do, that I practice. Now if I do what I will not to do, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. Before I interpret verses 18 through 20, I would first like to connect together a few verses I believe represent a vital thread in chapter 7. Verse 5, for when we were in the flesh, the sinful passions which were aroused by the law were at work in our members to bear fruit to death. Verse 17, sin dwells in me. Verse 18, in me, that is, in my flesh, nothing good dwells. Verse 20, sin that dwells in me. Verse 23, the law of sin which is in my members. What all of these verses teach us is that sin operates within the domain of the flesh. We, like God, are tripartite beings composed of spirit, soul, and body. Paul refers to the spirit and soul as the inward man. He refers to the body as either the flesh or members. It is the physical side of each of us that is most susceptible to sin and therefore becomes enslaved to sin. Remember chapter 6, verse 12. Therefore do not let sin reign in your mortal body, that you should obey it in its lusts. Living under the law, Paul found no way to overcome the weakness of the flesh. He says, for to will is present with me, but how to perform what is good I do not find. Paul knew what was right. He wanted to do what was right, but he found no way in himself to overcome his slavery to sin. Jesus said something similar to Peter, James, and John in the garden on the night of his betrayal. Watch and pray lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Matthew 26:41. Jesus acknowledges that the spiritual person within wants us to do well. But temptation preys upon the flesh is weak. Finding no strength within himself to overcome the weakness of the flesh, Paul resigns himself to the inevitable. For the good that I will to do, I do not do, but the evil I will not to do, that I practice. Now in verse 20, Paul seems to be shirking personal responsibility. Now if I do what I will not to do, It is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. Remember, though, Paul is describing slavery to sin. I am carnal, sold under sin. Slaves have their own will, but because they are slaves, their will is irrelevant. Thus, they find themselves carrying out the will of their masters and not their own will. So Paul is not shirking personal responsibility. He is simply keeping the metaphor consistent. I am compelled against my will to serve my master, sin. In spite of their best intentions, those who lived under the law found themselves constantly failing to keep God's commands. Let's go on to verse 21. I find then a law, that evil is present with me, the one who wills to do good. For I delight in the law of God according to the inward man, but I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin which is in my members. I find then a law. Earlier I mentioned that the law served more than one purpose. The law of Moses defined and condemned sin. This was its principal function. But God also revealed the law to help us see through our experiences how sin operates. In this experience, we discover how sin enslaves us, and that the only way to escape sin is death. However, in the process of attempting to keep the law of God, Paul discovers another law. Verse 22 refers to the law of Moses. Paul says his inward man, his spiritual person, delights in the law of God. There was a part of Paul and a part of all of us to which the commands of God appeal. We see what is right and we want to do what is right. But Paul saw another law present with him. This law, he says, is at work in his members, another word for the flesh. This law, he says, is the mechanism by which he is enslaved. It brings him into captivity, verse 23. This second law is opposed to the inclinations of the spiritual person. It wars against the law of my mind. And remember, mind is a synonym for the inward person or spiritual person. When this second law prevails, Paul says, evil is present with me. He calls this second law the law of sin, and it works in the flesh against our spiritual person. Now, some people interpret the law of sin as the taint of original sin which we inherit from Adam. They contend that each of us is born in sin, born with the taint of Adam's sin, and thereby inherit a corrupted nature. This is why some translators chose to translate verse 18 with the phrase sinful nature as opposed to flesh, which is the real meaning of the Greek word sarx. But as I shared in our study of Romans chapter 5, verses 12 through 21, I have real doubts that we inherit any sort of guilt or taint from Adam's sin on the basis of what is taught in Ezekiel 18. So what then is the law of sin? I believe what Paul describes as slavery, we would describe as habits. God has created a marvelous architecture within our brain that, with training, allows us to automate our behaviors. Some external stimulus triggers a routine, and the routine, once complete, triggers the release of this lovely neurochemical called dopamine. Because they are automated, our habits are, in a way, masters. And when good habits are deeply ingrained, they are a real blessing. But what happens when this wonderful architecture from God turns toward evil ends? What happens when we present our members as instruments of unrighteousness to sin? What does sin do to this wonderful blessing God created in all of us? What if, for example, people allow their minds to constantly engage in covetousness? Perhaps they allow their minds to dream of bigger houses, more land, great wealth in the bank, to the point where their minds are overwhelmed with a desire for more and more stuff. But then they discover that covetousness is a sin in the eyes of God. They now know covetousness is wrong, but the patterns of thought are so deeply implanted that they are woven into the very fabric of their outlook on life and thereby hold sway over their choices. Such people enslaved to covetousness might very well feel like there is a tug of war between what they know to be right and the deeply ingrained thought patterns that they allowed to run amok for years. One of the great deceptions of sin is we think it serves us, but in reality, we serve it. Covetousness appears to serve a person well by providing a comfortable lifestyle, material security, and a sense of accomplishment. But if the market comes crashing down, the covetous man will soon discover he has lived to serve another master. To relieve constant stress, some smoke cigarettes or vape or drink a bottle of wine or play video games and think that these items serve themselves, when in reality, something else is calling the shots. A habitual liar may use deception to regularly escape accountability. He may regard his lying as an essential tool in his hands, failing to recognize that he is in fact the tool in the hands of another. Sin leads us to believe we are in control. But the truth is, we cede control when we practice sin to the point it becomes deeply ingrained. This is the other law at work in our members. Through practicing unrighteousness, we allow sin to become automated. Thus, we are brought into captivity to the law that is in our members. As I draw this to a close, I'll leave you with a few key thoughts. In Romans 7, Paul proves conclusively that the law was not at fault for our failures. We were at fault. Living under the dominion of sin leaves one who wants to obey the commandments of God with a sense of powerlessness. In spite of their best intentions, those who lived under the law found themselves constantly failing to keep God's commands. Thus, sin thoroughly corrupts God's creation, hijacking the mechanisms He created for our good, our benefit, and turning it against what we know to be good and right and holy.